Thank you so much for coming. It's like Glastonbury, I can't see the audience until they turn.
Yes, you're on stage, you're on stage.
Pretty much a comparable size in the audience as well. Wonderful to welcome you here. If you're out there, I think you were just a second ago before the lights, this dazzling projector light. God knows how many lumens it is on me. Soon I'll be accompanied by the wonderful artist and filmmaker that we're proud to show and be in conversation with today, of course. My name is Gareth Evans. It's a real pleasure, as always, to welcome you all. We are in an incredibly suitable location here, given the thematics and subject matter of our artists' concerns. Of course, we're in a house gallery, and you can see, if you don't already know, of course, how much that will enhance and inform and energise the screening we're about to see. Not that it needs any kind of assistance, it's a remarkable project. And so please do now welcome to introduce it, the artist who made it, Katharine Fry. Thank you very much.
So this is blinding. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm not going to say too much about the film now. We'll be discussing it afterwards. I just want to start with some thanks. So thank you to Danielle and Nick for having me. Thank you to Gareth for being in conversation with me. I'm looking forward to that. And I just wanted to thank some people who made this project happen. First and foremost, Lily Grimes, cinematographer, who's unfortunately not here with us now, but the kind of crash course in lighting she gave me completely transformed this film. Thanks to Ned Cartwright, who is here today. He's the composer I collaborated with, and we can talk some more about the process during the Q&A. Thanks to Thomas Canida, my first ever and most brilliant assistant. Thanks to all of you for coming. And I just wanted to end with just sort of a sort of anecdote about the genesis of this project. It was born, the first idea for this film was born in a week where everything I'd applied for and every feeler I had put out came back as a no. It wasn't a good week. But I thought, okay, well, what can I make on my own terms to a scale I can manage? You know, like, I always come back to the motto, there's no artist without art, so what can I make by myself? And this is it. Thank you.
Hers. Yours. Out here. In there.
So thank you very much indeed, everyone. And of course, huge thanks to Katharine. Now let's start. There's a lot to talk about here, but let's start with where you left us in the introduction, because you had come to a certain kind of moment, right? A certain kind of impasse in things.
Yeah.
And yet out of this, of course, great creativity came. But give us a little bit more, if you could, about that moment and how you then found your way on this journey.
Sure. So it was a week in July. I'd just come back from staying with Danielle, actually. I was in quarantine, which wasn't that fun. And as I said, everything I applied for, sort of, from like grants, commissions, whatever, everything was like a wall-to-wall no.
And this is July 2021 or
21. And I was doing some yoga, and the I'm waiting monologue came into my mind because it's what I was doing, and wrote that down, and I thought there's still something quite urgent about the Doll's House, and actually after the last Doll's House film I made that some of you may have seen, a friend, director Margie Kinmouth, introduced me to, read it off my cheat sheet, Dare Writes The Lonely Doll, which is a quite strange black and white children's picture book written in the mid-50s. So I think I was feeling a bit sorry for myself that week, and wrote this like unwaiting monologue under the title of The Lonely Doll, and that was a working title for a while. And the Doll's House, she did get, the new family got some new furniture, but most of the stuff pre-existed from the previous film. But I needed a new protagonist. And Margot was the first doll I found, and Margot is actually that doll's factory name. And for a while it was going to be Margot in the house and sort of zooming out to me in my house, and we were maybe going to be co-performers. And I just sort of had that like long summer before, university teaching starts again, and I was still very tired from the last film. So I just started reading things, and what order did it come in? I think, yeah, I was sort of trying that, like, well, I don't really feel like working in my studio, so let me try doing some collage, which mostly was, an excuse to look at the pictures. And I discovered Grace Palethorpe and Ruben Mednikov, and their sort of the relationship between this surrealist painter and analyst, who, their partnership doesn't necessarily come to bear on my film that much, but after a sort of 25-year relationship, she was much older than him, they divorced, so then she could formally adopt him, and he named her Mother Flower. So that's where the Mother Flower sort of designation came from, and I think I was, starting to, well, that was the beginning of things coming in, but without really a structure. And then I'm kind of addicted to the comments section of The Guardian. It's like where the juice is. And I've been reading about like forensic psychology, and I've been reading about what drives people to kill or to be violent, and this kind of idea of violence comes when people can't tell their stories. And then that sort of segued really nicely into a Guardian problem page where a 9-year-old had written in with his mother, and he'd unfortunately tried to strangle his best friend. And his best friend had forgiven him, but he was finding it really hard to reconcile that aspect of himself. And the comments section was incredible. One was talking about his 2 children who say they have like bad selves in the mirror who tell them what to do. And another was writing in about his work colleague who said long ago in childhood, she'd sort of split off and named the bad part of herself Marjorie. Marjorie is also my maternal grandmother's name, so I was like, oh, I'll have a Marjorie. I'm not good at short stories, so I can write about
let's just take that first reply and add it to the great list of things we can talk about as well. The incredible response. I certainly wasn't expecting the Guardian comments section to come in there. Often more invigorating than the actual article, we should know. Clearly. Interesting about Margot as a factory name, because of course one can think, of a different kind of factory where people were named, of course, by Andy Warhol in a kind of simply manipulative and sort of often kind of puppeteering way, but that's for another day. Very struck by Margot being the factory name, because of course for audience members of a certain generation, a very famous televisual Margot comes to mind, right? Of course, from the 70s sitcom The Good Life, where Margot was apparently, at least aspiring to live the kind of dream existence of the suburban housewife.
And it's not clear if that's where she came from, because it's certainly that,
right,
sort of look.
And absolutely, and it's certainly very much, a kind of foundational impetus, if you like, for the work, clearly, in all sorts of ways. But there's a lot going on there, and interesting references coming. When I asked you just as you started about which July it was, it's extraordinary that this was in July 21, because you've turned this around unbelievably fast. This is a major piece of work, right? Clearly, a lot was waiting to come out, right, and waiting to happen. Yeah. So once you kind of got this, this kind of preliminary landscape you've very vividly described, how then did you find a way towards, this kind of narrative unfolding, and obviously a significant body of work?
Sure. Well, I still wasn't quite ready to do anything for most of the summer. It was kind of my fallow time. So I just started reading books, and I had a copy of Susie Orbach's Bodies from before, and I'd started reading it, and I found it very fascinating and quite upsetting, and I wasn't really ready for it. And I was like, well, maybe it's time for some Bodies. So Bodies is from the early 2000s. Susie Orbach is the psychoanalyst who wrote Fat as a Feminist Issue. So she's sort of bringing, I suppose, and actually it's quite good to name the playlists now. I had some sort of spirit songs that went along with my thinking about the film, and one of them was Mary Margaret O'Hara's Bodies in Trouble.
Right.
So the kind of, like shorthand for this film could be Bodies in Trouble. But I read Susie Orbach's Bodies, and in that she was talking about the Winnicottian idea of the true and the false self, and this is a kind of a splitting off that can happen in the infant when their primary caregiver is so misattuned to them that they kind of morph into a sort of into a false self. So they perform what they think their caregiver will sort of respond to in order to survive, but then there's this kind of true self that never quite comes into being, and sort of between that kind of kernel and then these various fantasies, she describes quite a few case studies in it, sort of fantasies of people, one man who thought he'd be much happier if he didn't have legs, or sort of an idea of, so I suppose you call it epigenetic trauma around bodies, or the sort of idea of like if a mother would have a mother-daughter relationship, and a mother who kind of only existed as a false self, and then her daughter following that. So I had these kind of things to hang on to as a sort of area of research, which sort of just reinforced, it gave me some language for what I was thinking about. So I would be reading and sort of dreaming scenes while I was reading, but in just quite a shorthand. So I would have a notebook that just said like Mari gossip with the witnesses or something like that. So every scene eventually showed up in this like notebook. But after Bodies, well, there was a while when I didn't really know how many dolls there would be. They weren't 4 distinct characters for a while. They were maybe just, there was always going to be a floppy one and a rigid one, and different ideas of what, if a malleable body was a positive thing, or if a malleable body was a kind of one that was sort of, I suppose, badly formed in response to outside pressures. But once I had the names, sort of constellation of names, Mari came last, when she spelled Marie, I pronounce it Mari after someone in my studio, not
naming no names, of course.
Not in any way to refer to her as a person, but I just liked that sort of twist. And then obviously there's a kind of relationship between sort of Mother Flower and Mari, or Mary, and Marjorie and Margot essentially mean the same thing as well. But I wanted to look at the kind of idea of, well, so there's 2, core relationships in that, the mother-daughter relationship, and then the kind of the best friend relationship. So I wanted to look at sort of obsessive kind of crush for and jealousy, that sort of conflicting relationship. And then Simone de Beauvoir's The Inseparables had just came out. I mean, it was a really nice excuse for me to just, sit in the sun and read for the summer. So I read The Inseparables, and the same thing. I was just writing out lots of passages I liked and sort of wrote adept underneath, and dreamt up some scenes. And then I went to Belma, which I don't know if some of you are familiar with the work of Hans Belma, surrealist, photographer, built this kind of multi-jointed, body-parted doll, and would stage her in various ways. And I think it was the first time I was able to look at Belma's work without thinking, creepy guy.
Yeah, for sure.
And I started writing from the inside. So I started writing as if I were looking out of the doll's body in her different iterations and formulations, and the kind of the idea of the anagram, and the anagram is a body that can be kind of rearranged or spelt out or spelt differently on request, is sort of what's happening with my multi-limbed Mari, and indeed the false Mari only speaks in anagrams.
I mean, there's an enormous amount in there as well. I mean, the landscape in which you're making this work, of course, is very rich, and you've given us, some of those kind of supporting and energizing texts. I mean, of course, one can put the finished work now into a landscape, where female surrealist artists, Dorothea Tanning or Carrington, are absolutely kind of informing and in dialogue with this work, one thinks of the recent, well, not so recent now, but pre-COVID Barbican show, The Surreal House, which, you know, absolutely this would be screened in, I'm sure, if it was a show still running. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the yellow wallpaper, of course, absolutely
totally riffing
central,
on.
completely. But then there's that kind of popular cultural reference landscape of the Stepford Wives, for example, where women, of course, are entrapped in all sorts of ways. Now, you've got this idea, you've written a lot, clearly, from what you've just said. Now you have to animate it and realise it. And this is where the collaboration starts, of course, and you name-checked, obviously, Lily and Ned and others at the beginning. But give us a sense of how the work then started to actually be made.
Sure. Well, actually, I met the Barbican in mid-September, and we were launching a new. We were launching a new programming strand then called Experiments in Film, and they knew I was going to be doing something with the Birkbeck Institute of Moving Image as well, and they're like, well, you know, we're not saying it's the same audience, but, you know, how productive are you? Do you have something new? And at that point I sort of had this, you know, literally this kind of research that I could burble through in these 4 names, and I think at that point I had the working title, When I'm With You. From there, so I just sort of said that, and they said, great, can you make it? I was like, sure. Then unfortunately I was ill for really all of the autumn. I didn't do anything. But during that period, I was working, well, I got in touch with a doll maker who made the quotes true selves, so the more complicated, mobile dolls. So she worked on those over the winter and gave them to me in early January. So I actually started shooting on the 3rd of January. And I set myself the task of doing, but by then I had one notebook that was this kind of, you know, like long writing out of chunks of texts that I liked and words that I liked and songs that I'd been listening to, and sort of interwoven in that were like, oh, you know, do something with tongues. Everyone's doing something with tongues, whatever, like.
It's true, isn't it? It's hard to disagree with that. I mean, tongues are central to this, but yeah,
tongues are central, but then I combed through that notebook, and in a separate notebook just wrote sort of like Margot suicide suite, 7 rooms, 7 possible ways to, you know, stage suicide. So I had this just sort of list of possible scenes, and I just set myself the task of shooting a scene a day for 2 months. So that took me until February. Lily came in. When did we meet before Christmas?
January.
It was in January.
It was like mid to late January now.
Yeah, because I'd shot one thing where I was a bit like, oh, this lighting sucks, I don't know what I'm doing. And Lily very generously, you know, talked to me about three-point lighting and how I might think about creating lighting on a scale in Doll's House. Because I think every project I make, I want to sort of be learning something new or discovering something new, and it felt sort of like light as a kind of like character and texture and force in itself was a big thing, and also just writing characters. I was very scared about writing characters, and I actually had some advice from Tony Guizzoni, who sent me a tarot exercise. So for each character I did a 5-card tarot reading where the idea is to ask questions rather than look for answers. Which, you know, is that kind of wonderful, I really like that space between procrastination and percolation. It's like that sort of delay for actually doing something, but it's kind of happening anyway. So it was through the tarot that I discovered that Mother Flower was a door.
Amazing. I mean,
as you do.
No, I mean, again, you know, I wouldn't have put the tarot down on my list of originating questions. But that's, you know, I mean, it's incredibly interesting. I mean, the you know, a primary reading, of course, of this, as you already suggested, is psychoanalytic. But that can only really come about when you manage to visualise metaphors as productively as you have done. It's interesting, I think the line that's given to Marjorie about her incredible sort of movement through the world is that she maximises her metaphors, right?
Yes.
Now, in a way, you visualise your metaphors very productively and extensively. But it's very hard to do that because, of course, it can tip over. But these are metaphors that we understand, I think, as we see them realised in front of us, without necessarily being able to reduce them into meaning. And that's the crucial thing, right? Or to pin them in a single meaning. So you've got this incredibly visually rich, but also miniaturised landscape. And what seems to be absolutely central to its success is the sound design and the soundscape, which really takes it into a different scale and also kind of enlarges its territory so it becomes the world that we're trapped within for almost an hour. So how did you work with Ned on that? Because it's very successful.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think I can't quite Ned's in the back row. I think when did we start doing this?
I'm trying to remember.
March, April,
Sounds
March.
about right, yeah.
Yeah. So I think I'd shot practically everything when we started talking. And I think the first two things that I knew were important was the sort of like the kind of three. I wanted this sort of like waiting intro, and then the sort of the suicide into the kind of like fantasy audience fanfare suite, and then the finale. And actually, it was like one of the loveliest processes ever. Ned came with a keyboard and we literally sat there and he started playing sounds, and then at a certain point he's like, "Don't be afraid to hit the key," and I'm like, so between the two of us, Ned was like, playing things, suggesting things. We were trying to find, and I don't really have any musical training, so we were trying to find a language to speak music in, which we did.
I mean, when you say March, April, I mean that's in creative terms like yesterday in terms of the film's screening. It's been shown at Beckham Barbican, and so it's had this kind of outing already. I mean, you have moved incredibly fast after this summer kind of lighting of the fire, should we say? Then obviously autumn outside of your control, and then back in the new year. Now it obviously builds on an existing body of work, and you were here earlier in 2021 with Danielle for Please Call Me Home, and your larger PhD is under the title House Arrest. So clearly these are abiding themes. Now where do you see this now sitting in that inquiry, that unfolding and clearly, of course, deeply felt inquiry?
I mean, I think the thing that I kind of come back to in every work in a different form is a kind of a threshold of bodily experience, for want of a better word, you can go back to the shorthand Bodies in Trouble, right? So all of these figures are kind of, grappling with how to have a body and what kind of body and who gets to frame or shape or dictate their body and how they move in the world, or indeed what is their sort of, the internally felt relationship with their bodies. So, the sort of the four endings, resolve that relationship in quite different ways. So, Mother Flower's destroyed as a kind of an unhelpful story of the sort of archetypal womb thing that she's the only one who didn't actually have a true self, because as a story she doesn't. And we're going to play with some pop culture references. She was probably the one that was like most knowingly was really thinking about the alien mother. When I came up with her arc and this sort of this strangely kind of productive entity, and then Marjorie's the only one who sort of acknowledges the dullness of it, and literally sort of it shatters the image to claim something else. And Margot has the sort of the classic kind of narcissist's healing of being seen and held and sort of reconciled in some way, and then Mari kind of continues my fantasy of what would happen if you could explode out of your body, and where would you go?
It's a huge question, and one that we can't answer now. I don't think we can answer now anyway. Thank you so much for setting the scene. Lovely to hear from you now. Gentleman here, very keen to ask a question before we actually started. Has your question been answered, sir?
Partly, yeah. It was just interesting to see this film after having spent the morning at the Surrealist show at Tate Modern. And when I was there, I was very aware of that relationship between the literary and the visual, and all those interactions between the artists there and the poets that they knew, whether it was Mexico or wherever. And I was just interested in that relationship between the literary and the visual and what you were doing. You said you were reading a lot and you were writing out certain things that you were interested in.
Yeah.
Did it all kind of come together as a kind of shooting script that was like it was almost like sort of a long poem that maybe you'd written, and that then became a shooting script, and then the visuals started to you started to work it all out. I don't know, just intrigued to know what that creative process was.
Absolutely, and I'm so happy you asked, because I was still writing the script and recording it on the Friday night before it screened at the Barbican on the Wednesday. So the words came last. So I had all of these notes.
Not they didn't come first.
So I had these notes, I had this reading, and I had this sort of, looking at the different eras of writing that I was reading and responding to, it's quite ornate, and it can also be quite technical or theoretical, and I was really nervous about writing characters and about writing a bad script. I sort of thought, I'm going to take every instinct I've ever had as an artist and discard it and do some bad approximation of writing. So I dealt with that anxiety by just putting it off until the last minute. So I shot all of the scenes that I dreamt up, and there's only one scene I shot that didn't make it into the film. Then I took everything I shot and put it in an order and made my visual edit. And then I watched it and started being like, okay, I need 30 seconds of lines about this. And I was literally writing and recording straight into my computer while I edited it.
Right, it's just surprised me because I thought we were the other way around.
No labouring on text, no. The opposite.
But I mean, given how tightly woven the text-image relationship is, and how layered and refrain-like its motifs are, it's really incredible how quickly you manage to complete the process. But again, it goes back to that idea which we've already spoken about. That you had a lot you wanted to say here, clearly, and it's just about that moment of kind of realising it and what might be the prompt to that. So the way that refusal, that rejection, of course, is perfect. Now we can see retroactively that was a perfect fuse, if you like.
I think it was great to have this, it's probably the most time I spent researching a work before I made it, and I really enjoyed having that sort of swimming around, but and I got to the point where it's like, I've got 2 weeks to write and record a script, and I sort of look at my extensive notes in tiny handwriting and be like, I don't have the energy to read this again, but what's the vibe there, and what's the vibe here, and how do I find a language that seems more right for these characters than a sort of flowery, surreal prose.
I mean, it's also just great on the larger creative process, isn't it? You have an idea, of course, then circumstances appear to go against you in the autumn, but you set yourself an externally imposed timeline, which you want to, of course, by definition meet. As you said in your introduction, an artist is someone who makes art, so that's what you want yourself to be and how you want to think of yourself. So very powerful, I think. And also, I can't help thinking, of course, with the shocking news from across the Atlantic, what this work means now, right?
Absolutely, the resonance shifted.
I mean, it's huge, right? And it's global, it's a world historical event, that, which I think we all realise, but the implications of which we can only guess at this stage, will be enormous, whatever form they finally take. But that was, obviously something that I'm sure we were all thinking. And it makes me also think, of male artists who have kind of worked with some of these themes, not least the idea of, of the kind of uncanny and threatening domestic space. We can think of David Lynch and so on. But with the accumulation of babies in the final sequences or the closing sequences, you know, I can't help thinking of Anthony Gormley's Field and wondering how much he was involved in his own children's childcare. Probably not very much, one seems to think. But I'll just leave that hanging there. Obviously on the ceiling in some cases. Let's move to other questions, yes please, thank you.
I was actually going to ask about the Mel character. So you've spoken a lot about the film, I
Plate
think.
man.
Yeah, crockery guy.
Plate man, yes.
He's mute. He doesn't have a body.
Yeah.
He's kind of a bit useless.
Yeah.
So I don't know. You've spoken a lot about the
Well,
evolution of
he's a fantasy projection, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's Margot's fantasy or memory, or you know, something that kind of motors her conditioning or her desire to perform. But you know, I mean, ultimately, well, she doesn't quite destroy him, but you know, he gets dismantled in the realization of this. You know, I mean, it starts with this tension of this figure being sort of absent or present, or not having been there or never coming, and then you know, you sort of, and you know, the relationship throughout to me, this looks like a series of like unmet needs, and sort of, you know, there's a kind of a triangle there of, you know, that Maori's looking at her and she's looking at him and he's not paying attention, as a sort of a dynamic. But then ultimately, you know, he's absent. He is voiced a little, I suppose. You know, you get that sort of play in the opening of like this sort of anticipation of some sort of wonderful being seen, held, celebrated, and then it sort of falls apart into a kind of domestic battle.
But of course he is also, you know, whether plate, crockery, jug, bowl, he's hollow, right? I mean, those are hollow, unfilled vessels. And he's also incredibly vulnerable because he can break very easily while presenting what appears to be a reasonably solid edifice. So, you know, that was really interesting, I thought, how he was realised.
Could I just ask about the making, the actual making of the kind of animation?
Yeah.
And is that kind of mostly you playing around with the figures?
Yeah.
Amazingly, I didn't realise there'd been a commission there.
Oh,
I thought.
Let's not call it a commission.
So okay, well, but you worked with the fabric, someone who.
That commissioning, that was a
doll.
Oh yes, the doll
The
maker.
making of the doll.
So she made 3 dolls for me. Yeah.
So there's a collaboration going on, but most of the making of the film was very much you mucking around there, but you had a script in your head, you had a narrative,
not a narrative.
So you were literally, you were kind of beginning to literally play and then build the story as you play.
So I knew that the first line was Margot has been waiting in her house for 40 years, and I knew that the last line was I left her behind. And the space in between was, as you know, I had these, each scene, I think there's 45, 46 of them, was a little note card that it would say like, Maori hands, Maori ribbons, Maori mirrors. So I'd write on that, you know, did I need to get some props in, and then I would just set them up and play, and I described my stop motion technique as a smash and grab.
But that was the strength of it.
You know, I knock the camera, I knock the light, I knock the doll, and I just keep going.
Yeah. So there was a kind of DIY aesthetic. You got all of it, which I think was very powerful and enhanced the themes. And we've got to go actually in a minute, but I felt the writing, the narrative through had a rhythm and a poetry and a power to it. So I'm like you, I really was surprised to hear you kind of added that at the end, because it felt like an hour-long poem to me.
Yeah, bits came along the way. So like I had the kind of the body, a body, her body, my body mantra, and you know, I do a lot of yoga, and I always find it really weird when you talk about the body, like it's in the belly, like, you know, you're very like sort of dismembered. Well, like there's a sort of a kind of an odd disassociation there in wellness. So I had that, like a couple of the kind of like the sort of the the mantra stuff was already written in notebooks, or like the bit that took me the longest to research, because I kept being naughty and going places in the spring when I should have been working, and I was like, well, it's fine, I'll take my notes and I'll write the script. But it took me quite a long time to research the lifestyle of ultra high net worth individuals, which is what Marjorie lives. And then, oh yes, more songs. So that one of the songs that was kind of constantly playing through my head that certainly runs to, and some of the other lines kind of scan to, was Where Do You Go To My Lovely?
Yeah. Were you researching those that ultra high net worth lifestyle in an embodied experiential way, or just academic?
I mean, I was being quite nicely looked after at the Ann Arbor Film Festival while I was doing that, but I wouldn't say, I mean, I had some nice cake, but I wouldn't say it was, first class private palaces.
No, you can have your cake and eat it at Ann Arbor, major American independent film festival. We're moving to a close now.
One small comment is that when you decided obviously to use your voice,
Yes.
there was some question of it should be your
Great
voice
question.
and be somebody else's. But also what is interesting is that you've got different intonation in your voice. You take different personality within your voice.
Yeah, so I mean, there were some sort of actual decisions and some constraints, and I guess sort of the play between the two makes the result. And I was in a sculpture workshop, and I had a woman there, Gemma, and if Mother Flower had a voice, that would be her voice. But Mother Flower doesn't get to speak, so I was thinking for a while of casting some people, or even just maybe like asking some friends to come and just see what had happened. But then, although one of the shifts from this Doll's House film to the last one is that obviously there were moments when, particularly when it's video, I'm obviously like a hand unseen moving her, but I took my hands out. But I was still quite into the idea that you might on one level understand it as someone playing in a doll's house, and the way that when you create and live that world, all the voices are in your head, and so you might think you're looking at like 4 distinct characters or 4 aspects that's being played out by one person.
Yeah, very good point. I mean, I think it seems inevitable, necessary, and crucial that you do voice it, given what you also said just now about wellness, which is striking, isn't it? And we're meant to be embodying and experiencing our embodiment in these processes, and yet then again they're displaced to the third person. The body is on the carpet, the child's pose, the downward-facing dog. Something I know well. Last couple of questions before we close formally. Any more thoughts?
Just an observation really about the male character was very intrigued by. I liked the way which he sort of seemed to enjoy, I think it was Margot, wasn't it? He enjoyed her sort of, almost like she was a delicious meal at one point. That was Margot's.
Well, that was, the sort of the play of this kind of the fantasy of what she might want versus this, disengaged figure. And I'm interested to hear how you might have read this. I was thinking of those scenes as, if someone doesn't want to pay you attention, like nothing you can do will ever get their attention. So, but I was interested in this kind of like constant upping the ante of this, this sort of like narcissistic staging of like sort of fantasy suicide, and then this kind of fantasy audience sort of affirming her fantasy relationship versus this disengaged figure. So I sort of read that as for me it's her in her staged fantasy, but you could also read it as a kind of creeping domestic violence if that's the decision you want to take.
Absolutely, yeah.
I was talking about his neck. He was like an amputee. So zoomed on his leg.
Oh, when he's dismembered, or
Well, there's kind of like he had no calf.
well, I mean, he had like a jar calf on one, and
There
a
was a kind of
calf
band
on
around
the
it. I know that.
Oh, that's the label on the jar.
Oh, okay. I thought he was like a veteran.
Yeah.
Whether we're reading, or in front of back from the front line.
I was dressed as well.
Shell-shocked
It's
partner.
PTSD,
All
isn't it?
around, yeah.
plate traumatic stress disorder. I mean, obviously, ethically, he hasn't got a leg to stand on. He actually does have a leg. But we should label him, for the disruptive figure he is. Yeah, thank you, Steve.
Yeah, what was for you the metaphor for the hands? I really enjoyed the hands being. Is that
so the wooden hands?
The plastic hands.
Oh, the plastic hands.
Well,
Yeah.
there's also
Quite a few.
the wooden hand at the beginning.
We've got
and then
we've
the
got
plastic.
kind of like the sort of, what do you call it? I was reading about aliens. Do they call it parthenogenesis? Like the anyway, the non. It's a different form of birth, right? You know, Maori's kind of literally emerging from some sort of primordial depth, which may or may not be mother flower, but that hand is her kind of originator. Then, actually, I'm going to just tip back to David Lynch for a second, because there were only a couple of things that I was like consciously aware that I was like working from when I set this up, or when I started working on this. And there's the scene in Inland Empire where there's a film within the film, and there's the rabbit family watching TV. So in the opening scenes with the gossip and then the hands, I have these kind of, I call them the witnesses, and they also were witnesses in the previous Doll's House film. But here they're kind of, they're the social, really. They're the sort of the social gossip, the constructions, any kind of normative pressure or expectation. So the witnesses and the team are all the messages around what she should be, and those hands are literally, the little ones are like literally shaping her into being. And then when we return to the hands at the end, actually, there's something else I was thinking about, which kind of feels like a trite cliche, but maybe it's also true. And I was watching Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock a while ago, and I think there was some bit where his sister turns out to be a psychopath.
Makes sense.
And she sort of staged all this elaborate, or to get his attention, staged all this elaborate ways to kill everyone who's important to him. And then he gives her a hug, and she stops being a psychopath. And I'm like, right, okay, that resolves it. But in a way, you're kind of thinking about the idea, well, doesn't everybody want to be seen and held? Aren't these kind of like core desires? So then these hands return in quite a different tone.
Possibly not at the end of a trail of dead, though. But that's a conversation probably for another day. Are there any? We'd like to keep going. Yeah?
Sorry, just wanted to go on. So between nurture and manipulation in the two, because the big one felt a bit nurturing, the little ones felt.
So the first little ones are manipulative, and then the big ones at the end are nurturing, and then the little ones are also, more generous. And then they come back. Yeah. Thanks.
Incredible. Well, as we've heard, there's often a tension in getting attention, but you have been a real pleasure as an audience. There's been no difficulty in securing, maintaining, and holding your attention. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Enormous thanks, as always, to Daniel and Nick for hosting and for initiating this great ongoing creative series. Clearly, given the incredible model of creativity that you have exemplified over this last short period of time, we look forward very much, Katharine, to many works in the time to come, growing out, I think, of this major, significant artist film that you've made. We've learned I've learned, separate from the incredible insights Katharine has given us, two important things tonight. I've learned that I can divorce my partner and be adopted by them, which I didn't know, and I might be putting that into operation very shortly, I have to say. So that's something interesting to know. Great always, I think, just in a cultural reference mode, to always give a big shout out to Mary Margaret O'Hara. Incredible, one album, a few tracks, roaming around the place, and of course a starring role in Jem Cohen's film Museum Hours, if you haven't seen that. So Mary Margaret O'Hara, if you don't know her, well worth listening to. Other than that, thank you very much for being here. Thanks to Daniel and Nick. Thanks to, of course, to Lily, Ned, and everyone else involved in making the film. Please give your warmest appreciation to Katharine Fry.